Hello, everyone. You are very welcome to this month's AWARE webinar. We're just going to wait about a minute to allow everybody in. Just checking who's here. Great. That's great. There's still some people joining us, but we'll start. So my name is Claire Hayes and I'm Clinical Director with AWARE. I'm delighted to welcome each of you and also very particularly our guest speakers, Trish Murphy and Paul Mulcahy. And we're going to be looking at how depression and bipolar disorder can impact on relationship challenges. And we've chosen this topic particularly for the week that's in it. Some of you might know that the hype for St. Valentine's Day has started already. And that can be wonderful for some people and it can be very challenging and even distressing for others. So just before we start, for those of you who are new to this webinar and new to AWARE, AWARE is Ireland's national charity that provides support for people with depression and or bipolar disorder. It offers free services in mental health and well-being services. There is a support group, there is support mail, there are free CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy programs, and we'd encourage you to have a look at the website and you'll be able to find all of the information that's needed. Today's webinar is part of a series that we started in January 2021. So this is actually our 14th webinar. And the others are recorded and are available for you to watch as well. We will have the opportunity for you to ask questions. So this will be interactive and I will be hosting. So if you see me putting on and off the glasses, I might even keep them on, I'll be fielding the questions to our guests. We won't be able to answer questions individually, obviously, and I'll come back to remind you about the questions later on. But first of all, I'm really delighted to introduce Trish and to welcome Trish and to Paul. So Trish, if I can start with you first, if you'd like to give us a brief overview of where you're coming from in relation to the topic today. And thank you very much in advance as well.
Thank you, Claire. So I suppose, given that this is very short, I'm going to focus on the areas of my particular, I suppose, background and experience. So I am a couples therapist, trained as a couples therapist and would have been hugely interested. So I'd like to bring that aspect to this, but also I teach and I train therapists in psychosexual therapy. So all about intimacy and sex in relationships, and I would like to focus on that also in this particular area because of course it's hugely relevant. So that's, I suppose, my really two areas that I'd like to offer. And of course I work with young people, mostly from the ages of about 18 to 24, 25. And so that experience and what's been happening now in the coming out of the pandemic, and actually dating in real life as opposed to virtually is another part of it that I'm seeing lots and lots of stuff cropping up in. So that kind of area.
That's brilliant. I'm really looking forward to it, Trish. And as you said, when we were planning this, it's an area that very few people actually talk about, and certainly publicly in a forum like this. And it's really great that you're doing that. Thank you. And Paul, if I can come to you, and first of all, just to acknowledge that your colleague Marta, your Veraska is unable to join us today. And Marta very kindly participated in all the planning sessions. And I know there are pieces of information that you're going to be taking that Marta wants to highlight, but that's later on. First of all, you're very welcome. So would you give us a context, please, in terms of where you're coming from today?
Certainly. I hope you can still see me because actually the picture has frozen at my end.
I can hear you, but you're frozen. So
yeah.
Yes, I mean with Zoom that happens, but it tends to. So long as we can hear you for the moment, it's a very nice picture. You're looking well. With your mouth open, so you can relax.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I suppose just to give a little bit of background about myself, I'm a psychotherapist. I work with I work with Theatre House, I work with MyMind, I work with another organization called Headway that works in acquired brain injury. And I suppose I'm coming to it today, maybe just thinking of some of the things that I have heard people, what can I say, asking for or getting value from knowing, kind of psychoeducation pieces that people have gotten value from in therapy. Myself, just around, understanding their role in a relationship, or understanding what's maybe driving certain parts of a relationship to them. I'm also really coming at it from I'm really interested to hear what Trish has to say, because as you said, it's not something that is spoken about that much, and I think it's great to have this opportunity to hear Trish speak on the subject.
Great, thank you, Paul. And we're focusing because Aware is a charity that supports people with depression and bipolar disorder. But when you come to it, I think every single person who is fortunate to listen to this, whether now or in the recording later, will relate to it, because depression is so prevalent. Any of us can experience it at any time, and certainly we can have family members, friends who can experience it. And equally with bipolar disorder, while the diagnosis isn't as common as depression, there's a significant number of people in the country who do experience it, and a greater number who are impacted by it in terms of supporting them. So Trish, if I can ask you then, rather than me starting off with a question, what would you really like to start off with, please? Well, that is a question, actually, isn't it?
That is a question.
Well, that's my question.
Yeah. So I suppose the first thing is that most relationships experience a time when one person is suffering from something, feeling low, maybe on some meds for depression. So this is a very common experience. It's not an unusual experience. And difficulties arise out of that. And some of these we're all aware of and we're very tuned into. So for example, if one person is having a terrible time, the other partner wants to be of help. They want to be protective and minding and careful. And that's a lovely thing to do. So there are two difficulties with it though. One is that there was this wonderful study done in Guy's Hospital in London of 700 couples where one part of the couple was suffering from severe depression, chronic depression, so ongoing. And the observers of that, when they were observing the couples, they couldn't tell which was the one with the chronic depression, right? And of course, kind of we know this to be true because the other person starts to feel the same way. They're so empathetic, they take it all on. And gradually two people begin to sync, if you know what I mean. So the partner really, really, really needs to look after themselves, really needs to have, good social life, needs to have lots of areas where there's frivolity and fun and liveliness, so that they're not being, if you like, unable to function, because you need somebody who's going to be able to pull, if you like, fun and liveliness, if an opportunity comes up, who's able to take those opportunities. So I always think that's really interesting, and I'll give you the details of that survey because it's so interesting. But I also think that one of the things that I'd like to talk about is that what happens to us in our intimate sexual lives is obviously a reflection of what's going on. So for example, if couples fight all the time, a lot of couples who fight intensively have no sex. And the reason is that the intensity of the arguments is a replacement, or it is so intense and so consuming. And our bodies reflect what's going on. So very often, whatever is happening will be reflected in the intimate relationship. And we're so sad when that happens, when we're not feeling attractive, or feeling that somebody's attracted to us, or feeling that we can have this sense of being desirable. And yet, when you're suffering, when everything is dark and black, it's very hard to feel that sense of attraction and desire. It's very hard. And yet the sadness of losing that can actually contribute even more to it. We also have in couples where one person doesn't want to put pressure on the other person. They don't want to pressurize, their partner into, having sex or to whatever it is. So they then don't ask. And then the other person feels, oh my God, maybe they don't even see me like this anymore. And it's all done out of a sense of protection, but then the habits go on. And so they lose that really important part where, there's a whole other way of having fun and pleasure and communication, and it can easily, just out of habit, disappear. And nobody wants to talk about it because they don't want to cause hurt or pain. And yet.
Yes. And Trish, without looking at the question and answer box, I can anticipate straight away other people asking the same question that's in my head. What do you suggest then that people can do? Both the person who's experiencing the rejection or the sadness, and the person who's really walking on eggshells, possibly not wanting to upset or put pressure on the person.
Yeah, so look, communication is always going to be the first step. However, it's not just that, okay? So I think you have to take the risk that you can tell your partner that, you're feeling a bit unloved, or, that you really miss that part of your life, without dumping it on them, that it's okay to talk about it, because they might then be able to talk about their sense of loss around it. But we do it because we, certainly in Ireland, and I don't know about other countries, we associate expressing love with protection and worry, right? So the way that we love somebody is we try to protect them, or we worry about them. I'd love us to get rid of that. And I'd love us to have faith in the other person that they are able to handle it. So that if I say, look, I'm really missing this intimate part of my life, that the other person is not going to fall apart and feel guilty, that they actually can say, I understand that, and maybe we can do something about it. And there actually are lots of things you can do. So what we try to do is reintroduce body pleasure, and you introduce it in a very slow and careful way, but it can be so good. I don't know if anyone listening or watching this remembers the old days when you couldn't have sex, but you could have loads and loads of heavy petting, and it went on for years sometimes. There's a lot to be said about that. There's a lot to be said about allowing yourself some sensual pleasure in whatever way your body is able to handle it. And then as your body gets used to that, it can allow some more. And as couples begin to share that, it's incredibly intimate, but it's not pressurized, and it can become something that's really enjoyable, but not forced. However, of course, I am going to say that if you want to work on anything like this, there's homework. You have to put time aside for it. You have to turn up for it. You can't say, I prefer to watch TV, and the more you put into it, the more you're going to get out of it. And there are lots and lots of great stuff available about guided stuff about how you do this. But pleasure and body pleasure and feeling attractive, allowing desire to work, even at whatever level it's at, is something that makes it worthwhile living. And it can give you, and it can give the couple, both people, that sense of connection that may be lost. And like most couples lose it at some stage. But the first step, of course, is being courageous enough to say, I'd like to have some of this in my life.
And what you just said, Trish, most couples lose it at some stage. I think that is so important, because a lot of us would think, if we're experiencing any difficulties, nobody else is. Everybody else's lives are, perfect and getting on, and just, really hearing that most couples lose it at some stage. So it's a challenge for everybody to really put energy and effort into that part, into our intimate part of our lives, our sex part of our lives.
So, yes, Paul. Yes, please.
Sorry, first of all, apologies for dropping out. I'm back on my phone. But I just wanted to echo that point about, most people, most couples experience something like this. The number of times that I've come across this in practice, and, that there's that element of embarrassment or shame around it. The number of times that I've come across this, with friends personally, and kind of, it's something that is kind of almost uncomfortable and embarrassing to bring up. It's, yeah, it's there for so many people that I meet.
And let's stay with you, Paul, then for a few moments, and we'll come back to you, Trish, if that's
Sure.
okay. And Paul, I was just thinking while Trish was speaking that certainly not everybody is is a couple, is part of a couple. So as challenging and all as this can be for somebody who is, I think for somebody who isn't, it can actually be even, well, maybe not more difficult, but again, the lack of communication, we can assume that everything would be brilliant if we were part of a couple. And everything is terrible because we're not. And, you know, both of those aren't correct. So what would you like to say, anyway, instead of me priming you, what would you like to say on the topic? And then we'll come back to
there's unfortunately, because I dropped out, I missed a chunk of what Trish said. So
she gave the winning lottery numbers, but I said I wouldn't give them to anyone else.
You know, I heard Trish mention self-care at the very start, and you know, that's for me. I just wanted to echo that point because I think it's so important. You know, that aspect of you know, as they say on the airplane. You know, when they're giving the safety demonstration on the airplane, they talk about put on your own mask first. But you can't help somebody without if you're incapacitated yourself. You know, you have to help yourself to be able to help somebody else. So I think that's ferociously important.
And Paul, if I can give a plug there for one of Aware's services, is the Relatives and Friends program. And this is a core support for people who are the other person in the relationship, whether that's a partner or a friend or a sibling who is concerned about someone. And it's very much helping them do exactly what you just said, looking after themselves first. And also one of last year's webinars was working on support, was looking at the area of supporting the supporter. And we had Tom Parlin and his wife Mary on talking about Mary's experience of supporting Tom, and Tom is very open about his experiences of depression. So just to mention those as resources as well. And Karen is listening very carefully here in the background. She'll be coming back to you, Trish, to get the resource you mentioned, and with me as well. And she'll be letting people know these resources as we go along. So Paul, sorry, I interrupted you there.
Quite all right. Another thing, and you know, I'm kind of again just wanting to kind of piggyback something that Trish said, is just around communication. I mean, you know, I think communication is so hugely important. But the point that maybe I wanted to make around it, and I hope I haven't missed something here that you said already, Trish, is just about what the difference between what's said and what's heard sometimes. You know, there's a story in one of Malcolm Gladwell's books, I think it's Outliers, about the different kinds of languages, like literally the kinds of languages we speak. But there's some languages depend on the listener to make sense of what's being said, and some languages depend on the speaker to make sense of what's being said. There's a really lovely example of this on I can't remember if it's a Twitter or a TikTok, but there's a guy called Killian Sunderman, I think is his name. He's maybe German and Irish, and he gives this example of Germans offering Germans cake and Irish people offering Irish people cake, and it's just about how the communication styles can kind of rub up against each other, and maybe what's being said isn't always what's being heard, and it's kind of maybe important to be aware of that difference between, you know, what you're trying to say may not be what the other person is hearing, what the other person is what you hear the other person saying may not be what they're trying to communicate, and maybe digging in around that. Two kind of pieces around relationships that I have often shared in therapy would be around, first of all, it's kind of to broaden out the picture maybe from the individual, is to talk about attachment, first of all. I don't know how familiar people are going to be with the concept of attachment. There's a book that a client recommended to me recently called Attached. I find it quite good, you know, just to give a kind of a background on the subject. You can have we're talking about 3 different styles of attachment. It all goes back to kind of your very first relationships, like relationships that go back before we learn to speak, earliest caregivers, and the kind of those kinds of blueprint relationships that we kind of take as I say, a blueprint for the rest of our lives, and that affects, you know, all aspects of our lives afterwards, but can give us a kind of I suppose what I've heard a lot of people say is that they feel magnetically attracted to certain kinds of people, and maybe there's a piece there around looking at what attachment styles are at play, and how, you know, if your attachment style and your partner's attachment style are setting each other off or complementing each other, or what that kind of what that information might add to your understanding of the relationship.
So Paul, can I check then? So another way of, I think what you're saying then is, for people who aren't familiar with the attachment, is that it's important for each of us to look at our own part in what's going on. So rather than automatically assuming the other person needs to be fixed or the other person needs to do this, we think about, what is it about this behavior that's bothering me or concerning me or pressing my buttons? Is that?
And also, I think just sort of where we come from, you know, that it's not just in this moment, that it's not just this relationship, but it's where we come from, what we've been raised to see as a normal relationship, the kind of what was our first relationship, and how do we try to recreate that first relationship, really. That's what I mean as a blueprint. You know, we take that and try and recreate that. It's familiar to us, and we like things that are familiar. Maybe sometimes we're more comfortable with something that's familiar than something that's helpful. And how do we try to recreate that blueprint relationship throughout our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just thinking that some people can do the opposite. They kind of grow up with maybe violence, you know, witnessing violence when they're little, and then just completely not want to have any kind of conflict or even a healthy, assertive conversation. Trish, there's a specific question for you. Sorry, thanks, Paul. And the questions are coming in, which is great. So I'm going to ask you the question, if that's okay. And then if there's anything else you want to come back to, do please. But there's a question here. Can I ask Trish where depression and a separation has impacted sexual performance? And this is from a man. And this then impacted how he feels in the relationship, and a loss of connection with his partner as a result.
Yeah, of course. Look, like I often think we somehow think our bodies are separate, and, you know, we go into a sexual situation and then we say to our bodies, okay, perform, you know, and of course that's not going to happen, because your body is going to express, it's going to protect you. So if you are feeling, you know, a little bit retreated into yourself, you've had some severe hurts and you've been, you know, targeted a bit, and then you expect your body to just go and perform, it's not going to do it. And then what do is we put even more demand on it. We say, you're terrible. And then we get all kinds of fear, of anticipatory fear of future failure. So you work with your body. And if your body can trust you not to put it in terrible situations, or trust you that you are going to give it pleasure and not give it an exam to reach a certain, you know, orgasmic peak or something, then your body will actually start to trust you and allow itself to express itself more and reach out. So it's almost like the opposite of anxiety, you know, that if you allow desire to work, you're not putting it in a dangerous situation with somebody who's going to criticize it. It will gradually be more trusting and will allow more to happen. So I suppose if I could put a banner on it, it would be pleasure, not performance. That's the aim. And most of us do not treat our bodies well. Most of us just criticize. We have years and years and years and years of it. And so then when you expect it to perform and your body doesn't even trust you to be even nice to its internally, it's hardly going to happen. So it's a piece of work to do, but it's a lovely piece of work if you can allow it, you know. And I was going to say one other thing that might give a bit of comfort to people listening. John Gottman's work, which is, you know, he's written millions of books. But anyway, there's one piece in it that I think is worth noting. So very well researched. And that is, in the lifetime of a couple, 69% of their arguments will never be resolved in the course of their life together. So you know this from your parents, they're still arguing about the same thing, and it doesn't matter. That does not affect whether the relationship is successful or not. Imagine you'll still be having the same argument 20 years from now. I find that a little bit anyway. But what matters is how you argue. And I think it's really worth knowing that it's how you argue, not that you argue, that is the thing. And it's not that you come to a resolution or anything, but we could do with learning these things. And if you want to argue well, the research says lots of affection, right? If you can have, lots of affection, joy as in liking yourself, that you get joy in your own life, and humor and lightness is so important. And just one last little vignette. I worked with a couple who, they had separated twice in their life together and gotten back again. And they were trying to undo some of the patterns that they'd had. Anyway, it was really difficult. But what they did, and they gave me permission to say this, is they both got a little tattoo of a heart on on their hips. And so when they argued, you'd have to put your finger on the heart, the tattoo of the other person. Now, it could be a little dangerous because they were very fiery, but it made them laugh so much that they found that they couldn't continue with the seriousness of whatever it is that they were into. And so there's something about learning these things and knowing some of this stuff that's really helpful, because you don't have to resolve couple issues all by yourself.
That's really helpful. I'm just thinking, Trish, as you're saying about the joy and the fun and looking after yourselves, for anyone who's experiencing depression or bipolar disorder, that can be really difficult, because the depression can be down, and then if somebody isn't well with bipolar disorder, they could be unnaturally high, and their partner might see that as, a warning sign, whereas the person themselves might think, well, this is great, and I'm, and we know that people can be promiscuous at some point, and can be vulnerable as well if they're not taking advantage, if they're not minding themselves and protecting themselves. And equally, if they're in a low phase of bipolar disorder, that can be very difficult too. And also medication can impact as well. So Paul, you're nodding there, so I'm going to come to you. And there's a question here that I think is in relation to what you said. So I'll make the comment as a link. So this is a lady saying that she likes the concept of a different language, and she finds a working understanding of interacting with another person is important. She agrees with the sexual expression of interest, and it's like sharing. And then her question is, with that, how do you not let depression interfere in that? Is it possible, and how do you manage it?
Maybe I'd pick up on the word interfere. Okay. Is it possible to not let it interfere?
Yeah, that's my word. She actually said bother was the word she used.
Okay, because I think it's very hard to not have it to not have it present. It's part of one person's experience in the relationship at this time, so I think trying to not have it present is trying to fly with one eye closed. Kind of, we're almost kind of cutting something off. We're not acknowledging something. I'm going to come back to the idea of communication. It's about in that piece around support. I think what happens, certainly for me in therapy with clients, is that over time we develop almost a shorthand, codes of maybe images that represent how somebody is feeling today. To go and take Stephen Fry's example of the black dog, how close is the black dog to you today might be a common kind of a code to use here. But just to that maybe in the relationship that there is a code, a way of talking about this, a way of communicating what's going on for both parties around. In your question, you were talking about the extremes of bipolar, and how do we communicate my experience of what's going on for you right now, and vice versa. So I would absolutely come back to the the idea of communication and how do we build good, clear ways to communicate with each other. I'd go back to John Gottman's work. You know, John Gottman talks about figuring out what, I'm thinking of a specific example that from a training that I was at, around figuring out what Christmas means for both people in the relationship, and you know, knowing what your expectations of what's happening here compared to what your partner's expectations of what's happening here are, and being able to communicate around that. I think that would be where I'd go with that.
Yeah, and St. Valentine's Day coming up, I think is, you know, some people's nightmare heading out to celebration.
Absolutely, yeah. And what?
Yeah.
Just to come back explicitly on that, you know, if we're talking about somebody, about two people in a relationship, you know, what's your partner's expectation of, or, you know, learning of St. Valentine's Day? How does that compare to yours? How do you negotiate what happens between you on that day? You know, it's yeah.
Thank you. There's another question here in relation to what you were saying, Trish, about looking after yourself. And this person saying that the carer can experience burnout. And even though they want to empathize with their partner who is depression, they can just feel so detached and resentful the longer the years go on. And then on reflection in the beginning, this person is saying that he or she did not take care of themselves and then spent time supporting and fixing another. And I think this is where a conversation like this is so important to really highlight this. But what would you think, Trish?
I think that's, of course, happens. And I think it's great that whenever you become aware of it, it's really important to do something about it. I suppose what's really important is the roles that we play, you know, and being conscious of the roles. So when you become a carer, there's a certain expectations and you know, in that, the difficulty is that then you also want to be, you know, the romantic partner and the lover, as opposed to always being in that role. So, you know, again, as Paul says, if you can talk about these things, that would be awesome. I don't know if you can always talk about them. I think it might sometimes be just too pressurized. So it would really be important that you try not to just be in the role of carer in that relationship, because if you are, that's exactly how it'll play out. Yes. So it's even, you know, to try and play some, like one of the ideas I have that seems to gel a little bit is that can you as a couple create some, I would say make 6 cards, right? Of, I mean, you can call them anything you like, but you know, that you do a card, this is what I'd like in terms of what I'd find a little bit romantic or nice, and this is what I might like. And it could be anything from dancing to Bob Dylan to, I don't know, sharing, I don't know, a shower or something like that. And then every so often when you're stepping out of the caring role, if an opportunity comes, you just pick a card because you've already pre-decided it. And you go, yeah, let's give this half an hour, you know? And so you're not making those decisions all the time, but you've kind of agreed them and you're just pulling it out and go, look, it feels like there's a possibility, there's a moment here, you know, so that you're planning for the breaks and the opportunities that come up. So, and then you actually take them, because, you know, very often we see the opportunities and we talk ourselves out of them.
Yes. Which
is weird that we do that, but we do it all the time.
Absolutely. There's a question here specifically for you, Trish, and there's another one I'm going to bring to you, Paul. So I'll stick with you, Trish, for the moment while we're talking. And it's somebody agreeing with both of you and with me as well that communication is essential, but asking what can one do if a partner doesn't communicate any, and then if you bring it up, they get defensive and they twist it back on you.
Okay, now that is difficult. But when somebody is defensive and it feels like they're turning it back on you, you're probably dealing with fear. And, you know, so instead of reacting to what's being put up there, which is to push you away, it's really useful if you can, and I know it's demanding, to be able to see that they're reacting from a fearful place. And once you see that, your response, you're able to meet them as opposed to just react. Because most of the time, If we get pushback, all we do is we then do the pushback, or we go into our shells. So can I give an example of a child, right? If a child, and most of you will know this, comes home from school tired and they didn't get picked for the football team, they kick you in the shins and say, I hate you. But we don't take them seriously. We actually know that what they need to do is, I don't know, get a big hug or hot chocolate, and then you talk about it afterwards. And I have to say, as adults, we're pretty much the same. You know,
Yes.
when we're feeling terrible, we often lash out. I mean, I probably did it a bit last night, and I know better, you know, and what we want is people to come into our corner and go, there, I know things are tough for you. Can I get you something? Right? But instead, we've kind of lashed out and said, nobody cooked me anything, or, you know, so if you have the wherewithal to be the saint and be able to see that actually what's happening is something other than what's being expressed, you can solve it so quickly. And I know it's a journey to sainthood, but it's worth trying.
It comes back to us minding ourselves, doesn't it? Because if we're tired or hungry or cranky or, you know, overstretched, well, then certainly I am less likely to be in a position to do that otherwise. Okay, I'm so enjoying this. And Paul, coming to you, but also, can I ask you the question? You go first of all, and then I'll ask you the other question.
Well, I just wanted to piggyback on the end of that to say
Yes.
that I think that's an example maybe of speaking different languages. You know, that somebody's coming home, and to go with Trish's example, kicking you in the shins and complaining that you didn't make them something nice. What they're trying to express is that they feel sad and disappointed, and that they're, you know, angry with the world. They're not saying that; they're expressing it in a very, very different way that maybe needs some interpretation. But it is in in their language in that moment. It's how they're saying what they're feeling.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Paul. And this, I wonder if Jeremy Clarkson would like to resign and give me Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. I'm enjoying this. So your question for €20,000. So how to work back to feeling a sense of intimacy when you find it difficult to move beyond the sense of distance that you feel. No, wait a minute, let me read this carefully. So how to work back to feeling a sense of intimacy when you find it difficult to move beyond the sense of distance that you feel you needed to create to mind yourself. Okay, now I've got it. During his depression and to take care of practical things. So that makes sense. So I think we all kind of withdraw and mind ourselves. If somebody else is in great form, we might step back. So how do you then bridge that to have a sense of intimacy?
What I understood was something slightly different. I'm sorry, Claire, that it was kind of, what I understood was
language again, Paul. So great, your understanding of it then.
Was kind of repairing a relationship after an extended period of distance.
Yes, okay, I think so. Yeah, absolutely.
And the first thing that comes to mind for me is slowly, you know, taking small steps, because I think it's really connected with what Trish was talking about earlier, with, you know, coming back to that physical intimacy. But, you know, we in the work that I've done, certainly with people, you know, we have an anxiety about something, and then there's an anxiety about that anxiety, and then there's, you know, it very quickly becomes like a stack of plates, and you know, you can't take off all those plates in one go and just chuck them out the window like you're at a Greek wedding. You know, it's slowly and carefully. You know, I think kind of going to go back to communication. You know, it's what are we working towards, and how are we working towards it, and how do we hope to, you know, what's step one for us? You know, is it going for a walk together? Is it getting, you know, I'm thinking specifically of a married couple. Is it getting someone to mind the kids for a couple of hours at the weekend, or you know, a night time at the weekend, and do something together? You know, like I say, go for walks. Something as simple as that. Have dinner together alone, you know?
Yes, and I'm conscious, I meant to explain to just say publicly that when I'm looking away, it's not I'm not listening, it's I'm actually just keeping an eye on the questions as well. And communication it's really interesting, because that's the core of this. But we're talking about communication between a couple. But there's a question here. Burnout of partners is so real. I find it hard as society that society isn't really open to have these conversations. But here's a question about someone who's married to a person with severe depression. And this person is wondering, how do they explain to the very young kids, so it's a lady, why daddy spends so much time in bed or alone or is very quiet? So it's communicating to children, and it could also be to siblings or to friends, to others. Trish, what would you take on? Oh, sorry, Paul, you want to take that? That's perfect. The next one.
I was going to just jump in very quickly with,
Yes.
Explain it very simply, age appropriately. It's kids don't, I think, really, I was going to say kids don't understand what depression is. I don't think that's true. I think they do understand what depression is, but in the words that we would use to tell them as grown-ups, I don't think they understand it. It's going back to, mommy or daddy is, sad today, or, they need a break. They need their, I'm trying to think of a child appropriate word for overwhelmed, but I can't think of one. But it's going back to go down to their level.
Yeah. And also that's a question where that person might like to reach out maybe to a GP or to school and get some help. Maybe there could be an education psychologist who might be, if the child is exhibiting difficulties, or other agencies as well. And Trish, if there's anything you want to add in this one, and then also there's a question on sexuality, and it's specifically asking about whether you've heard of bipolar disorder affects the brain so that the person doesn't feel anything during sex. And she's saying that this is what's happened to her, and the doctor insists it's not the medication that's causing this. And I know when we were preparing for this, you were talking about the impact of medication, that it can impact on people's whole sex drive, I presume, as well as their sense of being attractive.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there, of course, there's an effect of medication, and but whether it would actually stop all feeling, I wonder about that. So there is the effect of medication, which may well dampen all kinds of bodily expression, because it can be helpful in some areas. I suppose you'd have to work with your doctor on this, and you'd have to work that, you'd have to do the history. Can you pinpoint it started with the medication? Can you pinpoint it got worse with increasing medication? You'd want to look at all of that. But as with most things, we are psychologically, emotionally, physically connected, and all of these things are often mixtures and add-ons to something else. So you'd really want to look at what gives you pleasure. Is there, does food give you pleasure? Can you begin to retrain your body for pleasure? And that can be done on your own, obviously, but you'd need to do it deliberately, because you have to check it out. Or have you decided that there's such a cutoff that nothing is happening? I mean, it's really worth looking at this, because, pleasure in life is so important to us, like the pleasure of a tight hug, the pleasure of, nice food, or reading, or feeling the rain on your skin. So, sometimes we've been through an awful lot, a huge amount, and it's like we've been traumatized, and our bodies go into such retreat that it's worth really beginning to take it step by step and seeing, can you, and just to mix this with something else that we were talking about, Claire, it's if you've had a big distance between you and somebody else for a long time, and you want to cross that distance, as Paul says, there's different languages, but one of the things that you might do is you might try, we all do like pauses or meditation little pieces where you stop and you breathe and all of that. But can you do that with somebody else? Could you allow a hug to happen where you connect with your, breathing, and you connect with the sounds, and you connect with the textures? And there's no expectation in it, but just 30 seconds of that. The courage it takes to do that, and the vulnerability it takes to do that, can be huge. But so much can happen in the emotional release, or whatever goes on in that 30 seconds or a minute, that you'd be amazed. Now, I mean no expectations. It can't be anything other than that. But there's incredible power in it. And that step that you're talking about is the first step, is to be vulnerable enough to acknowledge what's happening, and then to bring that to somebody that you trust. It's kind of magical, but it's scary. I do get that.
absolutely. And I had a slight smile there, Trish, because I'm thinking people who are familiar to these webinars will think, oh, Claire's just about to go onto her A.B.C coping sentence. So I am. So this is my way of bringing together the key elements of cognitive behavioral therapy. So A, acknowledge. So I feel left out. I feel upset. I feel rejected. I feel sad. B, because either we're having difficulties in the relationship, or because I think this person doesn't understand me, or because I think I'm not attractive enough. And then C is choose. So what are we going to choose to do? But I choose to take care of myself. But I choose to learn to communicate as best I can. But I choose to let him or her know. But I choose to look after my own well-being. So A, acknowledge, B, because, and C, choose. So I didn't think I was going to say that, but it's like brushing my teeth every day. And thank you so much for that, Trish. I'm going to come back to you in a few moments for your key point that you'd like to take away point. And Paul, there's a lovely opportunity for you here, because I know that you wanted to say something that Martha had asked. And the question is there any low-cost counselling in Limerick, please? So there's your smile.
Well, yes. So Martha was hoping to make reference to MyMind's free counselling project. It's operating throughout all of 2022, and who knows, it may be continued after. The criteria, it's for over 18s, first of all. It's, for COVID-19 related, COVID-19 affected. So we're talking about, it's quite broad. It could be talking about bereavement, isolation, could be talking about depression and anxiety, loneliness, people who have worked on the front line, GPs, nurses, care workers, people who've worked in the creative arts, who had their livelihoods just sort of switched off like a tap. Similarly, people who work in hospitality, who had the same kind of thing happen to them. Chronic illness, all of this. If you think you've been affected by COVID-19, get in touch with the office. If you're not sure if you've been affected by COVID-19, get in touch with the office, and they're really lovely. They'll help point you in the right direction. MyMind is the name of the organization. There's mymind.org. The phone number is 0818 500 800. But as long as you remember MyMind, just stick that into Google and it's taking the right direction. There's loads of low-cost options there. Limerick, absolutely. There's a face-to-face centre in Limerick. As I say that, I'm 80% sure of that. But also, what I think is wonderful about MyMind is that there's the webcam option. The whole thing is set up there that you can see people over webcam. It was there before the pandemic kicked in, and it was fantastic. I mean, it was great for the people that I was seeing at the time, that we could change over instantly.
Okay, and Paul, you've got an immediate thank you from the person who asked that question. So that's obviously been very, very helpful.
Great stuff.
And also just to add in for people to also check with their GPs, because GPs have a really good sense of who's around, but also who's a good match. So we're coming towards the end, and there's a question here, and we could open it up, just not to close it down. So just to really acknowledge the question, and Trish, I'll ask you, if you like, or Paul, whoever would like to respond to it. What if your family has completely ostracized you? And I just think that's the question itself is so sad, because it'd be so. So anyway, how would you respond to that, Trish? Please.
Oh God, it is incredibly sad. There was some research done on is there multiplication? When we ostracize, when somebody's ostracized, the pain is so bad that it turns physical. I mean, Panadol actually helps. So everything in us as human beings, it's a push for every part of us to get back into the group, because it is, such a bad feeling. So what I would say, and I would say this, right? I think there's always opportunities. I think, we live in a world where there's so many recommendations for cutting off, but there's also so many possibilities for getting back in. If it arises, be open to it. But I think you can't live a life where you're the cut off person. So you then have to say where you have to make your community, your family, if you like, and you can do that. But it is painful and it's hurtful. But don't be the person who agrees with the cutoff. You don't have to, just because they've done it doesn't have to be yours. And honestly, opportunities come up. They really do. They might come in difficult places like, a funeral or something. If it's there, don't be the person who's cut off. Take the opportunity and be open. And I know that's hard, but it means that you're not buying into it, that you're not that person. And I think that will tell itself in your own life.
Do you know, that is so powerful, Trish. Thank you. We've got comments to both of you, thanking you very, very much. And lady specifically said thank you to you, Trish, that she now knows it's medication and she will talk to her GP. So, Paul, if I can come to you for one takeaway point that you'd like to make, and then I'll come back to you, Trish. And the questions are still coming in, so I'm really sorry, everybody, we won't be able to respond to any more questions. There's one to do with bipolar disorder that I will respond to myself in linking it with the next webinar. So just whoever that is, just to let you know, we won't ignore it. So Paul, your takeaway point, please.
I think the main takeaway point for me is that sense of how many people are affected by this. That it's that kind of shame or embarrassment of talking about what's not happening in my relationship. And yet, in practice, I see it so often, and there's so much work around kind of repairing the relationship, getting the relationship back to where both people in the relationship want it to be. And yeah, just that how many people are affected by this, I think is an important thing to take away.
Great, thank you. And Trish, your takeaway point, please.
So mine's about being vulnerable, right? So I think that we should be courageous enough to say what we need. Not to expect the other person to meet it, but to be able to put it out there without, and I think that if we do that without the expectation the other person has to do something about it, we're starting something already that is bringing up my confidence and making intimacy or closeness a possibility. So it takes a lot of courage to do this. It really does. And I don't think we're protecting anybody by keeping it to ourselves. I think we're actually having faith in them that they can handle it, whatever we say, or they can say no. And it would be we'd change the world if we did that, actually. That's what I think.
Oh my goodness, that is such sound advice. Thank you. And again, more thank yous from participants. Thank you very much. And then the question, what can you do if your partner has a family member with bipolar disorder who's adamant they don't have it, but show signs of possibility of having it? Well, first of all, I'd have that conversation with your GP, and then you will be able to get advice from it. But next month's webinar is called Living Well with Bipolar Disorder, and it coincides with International Bipolar Day. And Aware, some of you might know, has just finished piloting a brand new program that is free, a service that's free for people who have bipolar disorder. It's an 8-week program followed by a 6-week support group. So it's 14 weeks in total. And the feedback from the evaluation of the pilot is absolutely fantastic. We're just bowled over in terms of people's comments and how encouraging they've been. So at the moment, there are 5 programs that are just being rolled out this week, next week. I would encourage people to look at the Aware website if you're interested. And then in March, Bríd O'Mara and Jen Treziak and myself will be talking about the whole program along with a person who has actually participated in it. So I'm really excited by that. Again, I just really like to very, very sincerely thank our guests today, Trish Murphy and Paul Mulcahy. And I know the wisdom that you have shared. The wonderful part of this is it's being recorded, so it'll be there for time to come. And just to wish each of you a really lovely St. Valentine's Day. And if you're not in a relationship with someone else, please, please, please enjoy the relationship you have with yourself. And if you need a little bit of extra TLC for yourself, this is the time to do it. So, Gur Maith Agaibh go léir, and I look forward to seeing you next month.